Good. Well, let me begin by saying what a pleasure it is to be here and to talk to you about C.S. Lewis. And what I want to do is begin by explaining to you how C.S. Lewis came to discover Christianity, and then move on and look at some of the things that Lewis says about Christianity, which I think are helpful to us, either in terms of developing our own vision of our faith, or indeed of trying to talk to other people about what Christianity is and why it makes sense. So let's begin with the biographical stuff. Lewis was born in Belfast in 1898. And in those days, Ireland was not partitioned, so Lewis was ethnically Irish. And actually, even to the end of his life, Lewis would keep referring to himself as an Irishman. But actually, the Irish, on the whole, think of Lewis as being an Englishman, so he doesn't really belong anywhere, I suppose. Lewis grew up in Belfast, and by about 1910, it was very clear that Lewis was becoming an atheist. In fact, I have to say, quite an aggressive atheist. And obviously, we can't take Richard Dawkins and send him back to 1910. But you know, Lewis, in his letters of that age, sounds to me what Richard Dawkins sounds like now. Lewis was a very dogmatic, very aggressive atheist, and was very, very clear of a number of things. Number one, that modern science, that means back in the 1910s, had discredited Christianity completely. And secondly, that for Lewis, you know, the problem of suffering really was, well, it was the end of faith. You couldn't believe in God in a world that was full of suffering. And as far as Lewis was concerned, that was the end of the matter. He did not expect to have to reopen those questions at all. Lewis was of conscription age during what we now call the First World War. They called it the Great War. And so he found himself called up to serve in the British Army, and he went into training at Oxford and then went to fight in northern France. And during the First World War, Lewis found his atheism being both reinforced and undermined at the same time. We have some poems that Lewis wrote from his time in France. And basically, his thoughts go like this. If there is a God, why on earth is he allowing this mess? The existence of all this suffering and trauma during the Great War is evidence that there is no God. So for Lewis, that was very, very simple. And yet, he was profoundly uncomfortable with that conclusion. Let me explain to you why. Because Lewis realized that if there is no God, then you can't blame God for the suffering of the Great War. So in effect, you're in a very difficult position, having to say, well, you know, it's all our fault. We made this mess. And Lewis found that really a very unsettling thought. But it didn't bring him back to faith. In 1919, Lewis went up to Oxford to study classics. He then went on to take another degree in English literature, and Lewis actually achieved what is quite an unusual distinction at Oxford. He gained what's called a triple first. In other words, at every point in the assessment process, Lewis got first-class honours, but it didn't get him a job. And for 2 years, Lewis was basically unemployed until, in September 1925, Lewis was made the Fellow in English Language and Literature at Magdalen College, Oxford. And he'd stay there for another 38 years before he finally moved to Cambridge in the final phase of his career. Lewis began to have doubts about his atheism. And they weren't just the, you know, if there's no God, it's all our fault stuff, although that was there. It's much more his feeling that although atheism might be right, it was unspeakably dull. And if you read Surprised by Joy, you'll see Lewis reflecting on his phase as an atheist. He talks about his early glib and shallow rationalism. It's a nice phrase, glib and shallow rationalism. What does he mean by that? What he means is that it's just incredibly simplistic, but also that it didn't plumb the depths. It did not deal with the deep existential questions he was asking. What is life all about? What do values come from? And Lewis began to realize that his atheism didn't actually do anything for him. And so he was left with a very unsettled position where he was convinced atheism was, probably the best option, but actually it wasn't really all that good, and was at the same time convinced that Christianity wasn't really a serious option for a thinking person. But even that began to be eroded, because at Oxford, Lewis met some thinking Christians who began to put him right on a few things. And Lewis began to move initially simply towards believing in God. In other words, not a specific Christian understanding of God, but basically about 1929 or 1930, Lewis was absolutely clear that if there were a God, then that made much more sense of things than if there were no God. Now, I want you to notice that's a purely rational conversion. It's not, in effect, anything to do with emotion. It's not anything to do with beauty or love. It's simply, if there is a God, that makes more sense than if there is no God. But then Lewis moved towards believing in Christianity. And we know the person who helped him make this final stage of his journey of faith. And it was J.R.R. Tolkien. And I'm sure many of you will have read Tolkien. And indeed, one of the points that I'd like you to note is that actually Lewis and Tolkien, in effect, talked to each other about literature, about faith. And in many ways, the Chronicles of Narnia and the Lord of the Rings are both outcomes of these conversations. And indeed, when I was researching my Lewis biography, and listening to Lewis talking about Tolkien in the 1920s, when no one had ever heard of C.S. Lewis and nobody had ever heard of J.R.R. Tolkien, but they were talking about the books they were going to write. You just began to realize you were kind of eavesdropping on a conversation that was going to lead to two of the finest pieces of writing of the 20th century. But Tolkien had a long talk with Lewis. And we know about this in detail because Lewis wrote a very long letter to one of his friends about exactly what Tolkien said to him and why it made him move from simply believing in God to believing in Christianity. And let me try and explain to you what Tolkien said, which had such a deep impact on Lewis. Lewis basically, to begin with, thought, look, God makes sense of things, so that's good enough. Why all this stuff about Jesus? And he couldn't see how that fitted into the picture at all. And then Tolkien began to talk about him and said, look, you're thinking that it's the creeds that really matter. Well, it's not really. What really matters is the story that Christianity tells about a God who creates, a God who redeems, and of course the story of Jesus of Nazareth is a very important part of this overall story. And what Tolkien began to explain to Lewis was that Christianity was fundamentally about a story which captured the imagination but also conveyed intellectual information. So in effect, the creeds arose from the story. It's the story that really matters. And Lewis began to connect that with his own love of literature, with his own love of telling stories, and began to realize that Christianity told a story which was true, but which also gave you a way of making sense of all the other stories that people tell about themselves, about the world, and so on. And we see Lewis really developing that idea in the Chronicles of Narnia, which I promise I will talk about later in this lecture. So by about 1930, Lewis has become a Christian. And he's clearly very excited by this, and indeed he writes a book, I have to say a very difficult book, called The Pilgrim's Regress, which tries to explain what it was that moved him to faith and the difference it makes. Some of you will have read that book. It is not easy, I have to say. But during the 1930s, Lewis began to develop a series of ideas, a series of approaches, which actually set him on the road to becoming the Lewis that we remember today. And as far as we can see from Lewis's letters, the process of thinking that went on in his mind went something like this. I used to be an atheist. I became a Christian. There are many atheists around. Maybe I could help other atheists discover what is so intellectually exciting about Christianity. And so Lewis deliberately took the decision to become an apologist, someone who tries to engage with the culture of his day, explaining what Christianity is, and of course dealing with problems and misconceptions that arise. And the first book that he wrote that really is apologetic is The Problem of Pain. It wasn't something he chose to do. In effect, he was asked to. People said, look, you're the guy who could write this book, will you do it? And that book appeared in 1940, as many of you will know. And it was read by many people. In fact, it is still read by many people. It's very accessible and very engaging. It has a slight downside. It tends to treat problems suffering as a kind of intellectual problem rather than something that we experience emotionally, but it's still a good book. And it was read by some producers at the BBC. And they were looking for somebody in the opening years of the Second World War who could talk about faith to the British public, A, in terms that they could understand, and B, in terms that would connect up with the worries and anxieties that they had. Because remember, the Second World War did not go well for Britain to begin with, and people were very, very demoralized. And they read The Problem of Pain, and they thought, this man could be the one. And in many ways, Lewis's choice was a good one. For a start, he was a layman, so there were no denominational politics to worry about. But they did have one anxiety, and it was this. Lewis could write books, but could he speak? Would he actually come across well on the radio? Now, anyone who'd heard Lewis lecture at Oxford could have answered that question. Some of his audiences described Lewis as having a port wine and plum pudding voice. A very rich voice. And Lewis was able to not simply get very large audiences to his Oxford lectures, but hold them as well. And in many ways, it was because Lewis had internally digested the works of literature he was talking about. He could simply, unpack these ideas and explain them without a note. And it in many ways entranced his audience, but his speaking voice was superb. Indeed, one of the early tensions between Tolkien and Lewis was that Tolkien got very small audiences at his lectures. And it was partly because Tolkien mumbled. He would have his script and he would talk like this. He would, in effect, look at this and say, the saga of Beowulf was really very interesting. And, the audience never saw him because he was so buried in his notes. And anyway, he mumbled, so they couldn't hear him either. But Lewis had this wonderful voice, and he gave these talks over the BBC about basics of Christian belief. The BBC loved them. He gave 3 more series during the Second World War. And if you read his book, Mere Christianity, you'll see it's divided into 4 books. And that's because, in effect, it's the 4 series of talks simply arranged along that division. So, what does Lewis say? I mean, obviously he rose to fame, but what are his ideas all about? Well, the main thing that Lewis emphasizes is that Christianity makes sense. But in many ways, it's not simply the kind of arguments he develops, which I'm going to explore with you in a moment. It's more the kind of imagery he uses, which is very accessible, very engaging. I want to talk you through some of these. Lewis is a very visual thinker. And he tries to help us see that one of the core principles of the Christian faith is that if it is right, then actually it makes sense of just about everything. What we see in the world around us, what we experience within us. And what Lewis really is saying is that Christianity is like a big picture that makes sense of all the little pictures that we have. Let me try and explain that in plain English. I want you to imagine that you're standing on top of a mountain and you're looking down at a valley. And there's streams, there are woods, there are mountains, there are little roads, there are cows grazing in the field. And what Lewis is saying really is, look, you could take snapshots of the cows, the streams, the woods, the villages, and that's good. But what you really want is the panorama, which not only brings those all together, but shows that they are part of the same picture and that they're related to each other. And Lewis is saying that Christianity gives you that kind of big picture. And the quote I'm going to give you from Lewis, which makes this point best, I think, comes from the end of his lecture, Is Theology Poetry? Question mark. If you want to know his answer to that question, well, it all depends on what you mean by poetry and what you mean by theology. But here is the quote he ends the lecture with. I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. And the point that Lewis is making is that Christianity gives you this vision of things which is so deeply imaginatively and intellectually exciting that it holds things together. And again, if you want to think visually, imagine you're again on the mountaintop and the sun is rising behind you, and as it rises the valley lights up, the mist is burned away, you can see more clearly, you can see further than might otherwise be the case. Now, of course, you don't see everything, and Lewis is very, very clear there are always going to be shadowlands, bits of life, bit of experience that, really still seem a little bit puzzling. But Lewis's point is they are less puzzling than they otherwise would be. I've talked about the image of the sun, which is very, very important for Lewis. He also uses images of mirrors, of windows, of lenses. And Lewis, in effect, is saying, look, the Christian faith is like a lens that brings things into focus. I've given you a quote from C.S. Lewis. Let me give you a quote from Richard Dawkins, and then we'll just compare Lewis and Dawkins. Dawkins, in one of his writings, River Out of Eden, says this: the universe we observe has exactly the properties we'd expect. If there is a bottom, no purpose, no meaning, no good, no evil, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. And some of you may have come across that quote. Lewis, of course, had died long before Dawkins wrote that. But if Lewis had been around, I think he might have said this: what you're saying simply is you can't see good, evil, purpose, and so on. Maybe that's because your lens is out of focus. Maybe you're looking at things through the wrong set of spectacles. And what Lewis is saying is that reality looks fuzzy, it looks blurred, unless you have something that brings it into focus. And you might imagine, that you have a telescope and you're looking out at the sea and you see a kind of blur and you focus it and suddenly you see it's a yacht with people on it. When you get the focus right, you see clearly. And Lewis is saying life is like that. We need something to focus so we can see things for what they really are. And that really is what lay behind Lewis's conversion. This realization that Christianity made sense of things, that it really gave him a way of looking at things that actually made far more sense than his atheism, and gave him what Plato calls a synopticon. That is a standpoint from which you can see things and you see them as they really are. So how does Lewis develop these ideas? Well, let me talk you through a number of themes he makes. First of all, Lewis argues that Christianity is reasonable. It's a very important point. If you're a Christian, you are not turning your back on reason, you're not running away from evidence. What you are doing is you're saying this makes sense, but then you're adding a few footnotes. One of the most important of those footnotes is this: that reason on its own doesn't really take you very far. And what Lewis realized, that as an atheist, he lived in a world which was limited to what reason could prove. And what I want you to think about is this: what actually can reason prove? Well, it can prove 2 and 2 make 4. It can prove that the whole is greater than the part, W-H-O-L-E, and a lot of similar things. But Lewis's point is these are not existentially satisfying. The truths that you can prove by reason are shallow truths. They're not the deep truths about meaning, about value, about identity, which all of us need if we're going to lead fulfilled lives. Back to Lewis's phrase, a glib and shallow rationalism. And here's the point that Lewis makes, which I think is absolutely right, and he makes it very, very well, especially in Mere Christianity. Christianity does not contradict reason, it simply transcends its limitations. In other words, to put it very, very simply, reason takes us down this road, then it stops. I can't go any further. Christianity simply says, let's go further on down that road because the road really is there, it's really leading somewhere, and reason just has to stop because it hasn't got the equipment to do it. Faith reaches beyond reason, going beyond it, but not against it. And Lewis gives a very, very fine defense of that, several points, miracles, mere Christianity being the best examples. So I want to begin by emphasizing that Lewis affirms that faith is reasonable. Richard Dawkins talks about Christians running away from evidence. I just don't know where he gets that from, because if you read Lewis, it's absolutely clear. He's saying the evidence is there. It makes far more sense when seen from a Christian than from an atheist perspective. This is about engagement, not detachment. But the second point is much more interesting, I think, and it's this. Lewis believes not simply that Christianity makes sense of what we observe in the world, but of our own world of experience. And here Lewis is tapping into a long tradition of thought that goes back to Augustine, to Pascal, but I think in Lewis it finds one of its finest interpreters. And what Lewis is saying is that Christianity helps us make sense of our experiences which are otherwise puzzling. Now I'm going to explain to you what he means and let you think through whether you think he's right or whether indeed this is helpful. I think it is actually really very helpful. Lewis begins by developing a theological framework. He says, look, if we're Christians, then we believe, to quote the words of Augustine, which you probably all know very well, that God has made us for himself, and that our hearts are restless until they find their rest in him. That's a quote in the very first paragraph of Augustine's Confessions, and Lewis likes it a lot. And Lewis's argument goes like this. If we are made to relate to God, if eternity has been planted in our hearts, to give you that quote from Ecclesiastes chapter 3, then it follows that if we do not relate to God, there's going to be an absence where there is meant to be a presence. There's going to be a sense of emptiness, a sense of dissatisfaction, because we're not actually doing what we're meant to do. And Lewis's argument goes like this. He's saying, in effect, if we're made to relate to God, if that is the supreme goal, if that is our true heart's desire, then in effect, until and unless we find God, we are going to be restless. And Lewis's argument is that modern humanity, in effect, attaches itself to lesser goods, to ambition, to money, or to things like that, which in the end do not satisfy and make us ask, is there anything that truly satisfies? And of course, that line of questioning brings us back to God. Now, many of you will say, well, that of course is a very traditional line of argument. You find it, for example, in George Herbert's poem, The Pulley. But Lewis, in effect, makes it his own, partly because it resonated so strongly with his own experience. And those who've read Surprised by Joy will know what I mean. There are passages where Lewis talks about this heart-rending sense of longing he experienced, which nothing in this world seemed able to satisfy, and therefore either it was meaningless or it was pointing towards something that had yet to be fulfilled in his life. Now, Lewis talks about this, I think, at his best in a sermon he preached in Oxford in June 1941. And the sermon is called The Weight, W-E-I-G-H-T, of Glory. And in it, Lewis is reflecting on who we are, why we're here, what is the point of life. And he makes the point that we've been made to relate to God. That's just a datum, it's a starting point. And therefore that everything else dissatisfies us. It may be, and these are his words, that we feel that something is going to satisfy us. We may feel that our heart's desire is contained in something. For example, a relationship or a possession. And then when we get it, we realize it's not there at all. That in effect, true satisfaction lies over the next hill or round the next corner, or it's indefinitely postponed. What these things that are good, for example, relationships and so on, in the end turn out to be signposts pointing beyond themselves. And Lewis used a whole series of images to try and make this point more clearly. He talks about, for example, it's like the scent of a flower we haven't found. That's a very good image. You like to imagine you're in a garden at night, and the fragrance of a flower wafts towards you, and you know there's something there, and you'd love to be able to track it back to its source, but you can't. It's there, and you're aware it's pointing to something, but it's difficult to find. And what Lewis is saying is that the Christian faith is the lens that brings this into focus. It's reminding us that nothing that is created or finite in the end really is going to satisfy, that God in the end is the one that brings true joy. And for Lewis, of course, that was what his own experience was. Now, clearly I need to say more about that. But I think for many of you in this room, you'll see exactly what he's getting at. Most of you have had an experience which goes something like this. You thought, if only I had this relationship, or this possession, or this qualification, or this job, then I'd be really happy. And then you get this relationship or qualification or possession or job, and for maybe a year or 10 seconds, everything is fine, and then you start getting restless all over again. That's what Lewis is getting at, what's sometimes called the paradox of hedonism. The pursuit of pleasure defeats itself. Pleasure for Lewis is something given and we receive it rather than seeking it. Now, there's a lot more I could say about that, but I'm just keeping my eye on the clock, and I do need to move on. Because one of the things that's most distinctive about Lewis is his appeal to the imagination, which he develops using stories. Now, I'm going to describe this in a moment, but let me pause here and just make a point which I think is very interesting. Cultural analysts tell us that our culture is split between those who would describe themselves as being modern and those who describe themselves as being postmodern. Now, that's the easy bit. When you start asking, well, what does modern mean? What does postmodern mean? It all gets a bit more difficult. But we could say, for the purposes of just simplifying an otherwise very complex discussion, that modernity is all about an appeal to reason using arguments, whereas postmodernity is all about being drawn or attracted by stories or images. I'm old enough to remember the introduction of British commercial television, and I can remember early advertisements for toothpaste. And what would happen was, that a man in a white coat, because he was a scientist, would come on screen, hold up a tube of toothpaste and say, there are 65 scientifically proven reasons why you should use this toothpaste. It's all about evidence, argumentation, that sort of stuff. Most modern ads for toothpaste are rather different. Someone incredibly suave and svelte will kind of waft onto the screen and wave this tube of toothpaste at you, and the implication is you use this and you'll be like me. And it's the image and association that does the hard work for you. What is interesting about Lewis is that he appeals to both modern and postmodern people. There are very few people in that category. Lewis is one of them. And one of the reasons for this is that Lewis doesn't just use argument, though it's there. It's also about using stories and an appeal to the imagination to try and help us understand what Christianity is all about. Now, you see this to an extent in his science fiction trilogy of the early 1940s, but of course you see it at its best in Narnia. So I want to just ask, what did Lewis think he was doing when he wrote the Chronicles of Narnia? Well, we think we know, because there are points where he talks about this a little bit, but never in the depth that we'd like. But it's very, very clear that Lewis's childhood memories were very, very important to him. He loved reading books like Squirrel Nutkin, but he didn't like Christianity at all. And as an older man, having discovered Christianity, Lewis began to think these thoughts. What if the medium that I loved, children's stories, could be a means of opening up something I did not love, Christianity, to me at that time? Might my life have been very different? And so Lewis began to explore the idea of using children's stories to open up the reality of the Christian faith. Now, Lewis and Tolkien both realized the importance of this. They realized that a good narrative that appealed to the imagination forced you to ask questions that you might not otherwise ask. It opened up possibilities which otherwise you might not dream of. Did you notice, by the way, that Richard Dawkins is now saying that we shouldn't be reading fairy stories? The reason is very, very simple. For Tolkien, a fairy story is a story that makes us realize that we are not limited to the world of pure reason, which is a very limited world, but there are deeper visions of reality waiting for us to discover them. And Dawkins does not want you to discover them. So he's trying to close down anything that's going to open up these new ways of thinking too. But that's a digression. And Lewis began to realize he could tell stories that would kind of way open up the Christian faith in a very accessible but very imaginatively engaging way. So I only have a few moments to talk a bit more about Narnia, so I'm going to just single out a few things I think are interesting. And then in Q&A afterwards, you want to follow anything else through, I'm very happy to do that. Let's go to The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. That's the first of the Chronicles of Narnia, and in my view, it's the best. The children enter Narnia, and as they explore and encounter people, they hear different stories about what Narnia's all about, where it came from, what its true destiny is. And there are two main stories. Story number one. This is the realm of the White Queen. It really is hers. This is her realm and she rules it. Then they hear another story, very often told by lowly people or animals like Mr. Beaver, which is, this is really the realm of the noble lion Aslan. He's away at the moment, but when he comes back, everything will change and this place will be restored to what it's really meant to be. And the children very quickly realize both these stories can't be true. They have to choose which of these stories is right. And of course, as you all know, the story of Aslan turns out to be the right one. But Lewis is saying something much more profound than you might expect. He's reminding us that our culture is shaped and dominated by what we might call meta-narratives, big stories. And people buy into these stories which shape everything. One of these meta-narratives might go like this. We are the random and arbitrary outcomes of a random and arbitrary process. There is no meaning or goodness in life except whatever we invent. And that really is what Richard Dawkins is saying. It's a very influential narrative. But simply because influential does not mean it's right. There's another narrative, which is that we are the precious children of a loving God who in effect demonstrates that love for us and has something he wants each of us to do. And what Lewis is trying to do is to say to us, look, we live in a story-shaped world. And in the end, you've got to choose which story is right. And the story that's right is going to be the one that makes most sense of things, but also the one that makes most sense of you as an individual. That's a very important point. And Lewis then follows through by making another point, which again I think is very, very important. If you stand back from Narnia and look at all 7 of the Chronicles, what you will notice is that the children, and there are many of them, begin to take their own lives and fit them into the bigger story of Narnia. In other words, they say, Narnia's story is going to be our story. We need to figure out what we are meant to do to make Narnia the better place it's meant to be. And the point that Lewis is making is very interesting. He's saying, look, each of us has our own story. It's unique to each of us. But it finds its true meaning, its true significance when it is brought into contact, into connection with the bigger story of God. And Lewis is really saying that we find fulfillment when we find our place in that bigger story and figure out what we are meant to be doing to move that bigger story ahead. That's a very interesting line of thought, and if I had time, I'd develop it more fully. Second point about Narnia, of course, is Aslan. Some of you may wonder where the word Aslan comes from. It's actually the Turkish word for lion. And Lewis came across this when he was researching a British writer of the early 19th century who specialized in the literature of the Ottoman Empire. And it used the word Aslan, and Lewis clearly liked this word a lot. Aslan is a Christ figure. And if you read Rowan Williams' very interesting book, The Lion's World, where he talks about the very deep impact that Narnia's had on his own life, Williams makes the place that Lewis is one of the very few people who's ever managed to describe what it feels like to have a relationship with Jesus, using Aslan as the model. And when you read Narnia and see the children's reaction to Aslan, I think you get a sense of what he's getting at. The children come into Aslan's presence, they feel a sense of awe, a sense of wonder, a sense of, we shouldn't be here. It's what you might call a sense of the numinous, if you want to use the technical language. But it's very much about being overwhelmed by the majesty of Aslan and at the same time energized by his presence and feeling that somehow he's very, very special and that you are special to him. So it's a very, very interesting literary figure, which I think brings out very, very well how central Jesus is to the Christian faith. And if you want to look at one scene in particular, I think it's the death of Aslan, where the imagery of the children stroking his dead fur is very, very powerful and moving. So I talk more about Aslan if I had time, but I wanted to make the point next that Lewis is able to use stories to bring to life what otherwise might be rather dull theological ideas. Lewis prefers to show rather than to tell. I'm going to just illustrate this by looking at one incident in The Voyage of the Dawn Treader. And again, many of you will know this incident very well. What Lewis wants to do is to tell a story which makes the following theological point. Humanity is trapped in sin. We don't want to be, but we are, but we can't break free from it. We need someone to do that for us. We need a savior. He tells the story of Eustace Scrubb. Eustace Scrubb is a schoolboy who is portrayed as being obnoxious. You know, the sort of person you would loathe and despise. He's arrogant, he's greedy, and eventually he becomes so overwhelmed by his greed that he turns into a dragon. Now, some of you will say, well, can we just stop there and ask how on earth does that happen? And it would take too long to explain. But let's just say that for Lewis, there's an entirely natural development, because for him, steeped in Norse mythology, a dragon is a symbol of greed. And then Eustace, having become a dragon, discovers he'd rather be Eustace all over again, and so he tries to scratch off the dragon skin and get rid of this new identity. And as he scratches, he realizes he cannot change his identity. He is trapped. And he's overwhelmed by hopelessness and helplessness. And then Aslan bounds in. And with his sharp claws, he rips off the dragon's skin. He throws Eustace into a deep well. Very strong imagery of baptism there. And Eustace emerges as Eustace all over again, but a nice Eustace this time round. And you see, the point I'm making is this. Look, I told you what the theology is, and you know, it's okay, isn't it? But you see, the story makes the same point in a much more powerful way. One of the things I want to talk about in bringing this lecture to a close is that Lewis is very, very good at what he calls translation. What he means by that is taking the ideas of the Christian faith and translating them into everyday English. Now, Lewis had to learn how to do that the hard way. Some of you will know about this, but during the Second World War, Lewis was sent around Royal Air Force bases to talk to ground crews. And Lewis very, very quickly discovered that the kind of approaches he would use when lecturing to Oxford undergraduates didn't work so well when talking to people who'd left school at the age of 16. And so he realized he had to, first of all, come down to their level, and secondly, rephrase everything so he could enter into their experiential world. And he wrote later, this is very, very difficult, but it was very worthwhile. And in a lecture given in Wales in 1948, Lewis talked about the importance of this. He says, you must learn the language of your audience. You must translate your theology into the vernacular. In other words, you need to use everyday language to try and convey the realities of faith. Now, I think that remains a very important point. Because very often when you're talking to your friends, your family about what you believe, you'll find yourself using words that actually may not connect up with them at all. You might use words like incarnation or I don't know what, salvation. I mean, if you take, for example, the New Testament, think of St. Paul in Romans chapter 5, he talks about justification by faith, which is clearly very important to him. But to most people in Britain today, the word justification means an excuse given for being late to work, or the fancy thing you do to a right-hand margin on the word processor. And you know, Paul wasn't talking about either of those. And Lewis's point is very, very simple. You've got to find a way of translating your language into the language of our culture. And Lewis himself, I think, did that really rather well. But he's saying to us that we need to do that as well. And Lewis isn't just talking about verbal unpacking. He's also asking us, what images might you use to help make sense of this? What stories might you tell to help people grasp a very important idea? And that challenge, I think, remains with us. Now, I'm going to end in a moment because I want to give plenty of time for questions. But I'm going to end, if I may, by talking about Lewis's gravestone in Oxford. And some of you may have been to see this. There was a lot of interest in Lewis last year because, of course, it was the 50th anniversary of his death. And Holy Trinity Headington tidied up their churchyard and cleaned his gravestone so you could go and visit it. And an American friend of mine went to see it, and he came back to me afterwards and said, look, it was a great privilege to look at his gravestone, but the epitaph made no sense. Some of you will know what the epitaph is, the inscription on Lewis's gravestone is, "Men must endure their going hence." And my friend said to me, look, that's about a stoic resignation to death. There's no sense of a Christian hope. Why is that unhelpful slogan on Lewis's gravestone? Well, the answer is very, very simple. It's because when Lewis was nearly 10 years old, his mother died of abdominal cancer. It was very slow, very painful. And the family had one of these Shakespearean calendars. You know, there's a Shakespearean text for every day of the year. And the text on the calendar for the day in August 1909, when Lewis's mother died, was "Men must endure their going hence." It's from King Lear. And Lewis's brother put that text on Lewis's gravestone to reconnect Lewis with his mother. But Lewis himself talked about his own death in much more positive terms. During the last few months of 1963, Lewis died in November, Lewis knew he was dying. And he wrote to some of his friends just saying, look, I'm ready for this. And he used a very powerful image to talk about the Christian hope. I think it's much more helpful than what we find on his gravestone. And he wrote to one American lady, he said, we're like seeds in the ground, just waiting to burst through the surface of the earth and enter into the real world. Then he says, you know, I suppose when we look back at this world from the perspective of heaven, we'll realize it's only a kind of world of dreams in comparison to the real world we now know. It's a world of dreams, of half waking. And he ends by saying, but cockcrow is coming. I think that's a very nice statement of the Christian hope from someone who knew he was dying and wanted at least one other person to know about the hope that he shared. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much indeed for listening. I'm very happy now to let you take the conversation in any direction you like. We've got about 20 minutes, and if you could just raise your hand so I can see you. I'm going to repeat the question for the recording device, so I know it sounds boring, but we've got to do that. So where should we begin? We'll begin here.
You said at the start about Tolkien's influence on C.S. Lewis. What made C.S. Lewis choose Anglican Christianity over Tolkien's Catholicism?
I mentioned earlier that Lewis was deeply affected by Tolkien. Why did Lewis choose to become an Anglican rather than follow Tolkien and become a Catholic? I think it's a very difficult question to answer because Lewis doesn't give us all the answers we'd like, but I can sketch out what I think the answer is. Lewis didn't really value denominational identity at all. I mean, his whole idea of mere Christianity is very much that of a basic consensual Christianity. And Lewis is very, very clear that people choose a specific form of Christianity, Anglicanism, Presbyterianism, Catholicism. And for Lewis, that's good. I mean, he says that we've got to do that, but he's saying we mustn't emphasize the denomination over the shared vision of what Christianity is. Why did he choose Anglicanism? Well, I think there are a number of reasons, but I need to emphasize that these are not really very powerful reasons for becoming an Anglican. Number one, it was in his family tradition. I mean, when Lewis was an atheist, he was an Anglican atheist, if I can put it like that. Secondly, if you read his Screwtape Letters, there's a very interesting passage where he talks about the importance of locality. That in effect, that's part of the way God orders the universe. And he says, I felt I ought to go to my local church. And he lived in Headington in Oxford at the time. His local church was Holy Trinity Headington, which contemporary observers suggest was not a very dynamic or exciting place at all, but Lewis felt that was where he had to go. He also, of course, started going to his college chapel at Malden. Again, that was an Anglican institution. So I think you could say that really it's a variety of factors that pushed Lewis in that direction, but none of them really suggest to me that Lewis thought Anglicanism was right or Anglicanism was best. I think it just Lewis felt, in my case, that's what I'm going to do. But Lewis, as you will know, was deeply influenced by G.K. Chesterton and very much valued J.R.R. Tolkien. So, you know, there's this very strong link with Catholicism, even though Lewis himself, you know, wouldn't have self-described as a Catholic. But there are certainly very important points of connection. And I think that, you know, that every Christian really can learn something from Lewis, because he talks so much about the shared themes of faith. I think that we can all learn something, even if we don't agree with him at every point. Thank you. Let's keep going. Please.
Just pick up on your point about story, there was an interesting letter in Private Eye this week with regard to Richard Dawkins rejecting fairy stories, saying that it is ironic that he tells us we shouldn't tell children that frogs become princes, because effectively the theory of evolution says exactly that that is what's happened. Do you feel that there is some hope that, just as perhaps the story of the universe convinced somebody like Anthony Flew towards the end of his life, that there is hope that Dawkins may see in time that bigger picture that you've described?
Well, that's a very interesting question. The questioner has just made the point that Richard Dawkins has rejected the use of fairy stories, but actually some fairy stories might actually be helpful to him, and of course might also lead him to a very big discovery he might not want to make. I think that's a very fair question, and certainly, I mean, there are scholars of mythology who will tell you that myths are not arbitrary inventions. Actually, very often they are ways of trying to make sense of a very complex world, and actually, you know, there's more in them than you might think, and I think that needs to be said. Where Richard Dawkins is going to end up, I don't really know. I suspect he's painted himself into a corner, that he's developed this very high public profile as an atheist, so it's going to be very, very difficult for him to change his mind. But as you rightly say, Anthony Flew did. I mean, Flew had this very famous debate with William Lane Craig in 1998. It was the 50th anniversary of the big debate between Frederick Copleston and Bertrand Russell in 1948, and Anthony Flew got mauled a bit and realised his atheism didn't work quite as well as he'd thought, and went away and rethought everything, which is very, very interesting. I think it's just very important to say that there are many atheists who are very, very vociferous and aggressive, but very often that masks the fact that A, they haven't really thought about things very much, and B, actually very often the aggressiveness is a vulnerable aggressiveness. You know, I don't want to talk about this because actually you might be right. So in effect it's about trying to keep you away. So I think we just need to persist and be gracious and patient, because there could be some very interesting conversations that might happen. Thank you. Right at the back, please. Well, that's a very interesting question. The question is, should there be a new translation of the Mass to try and connect up with where the English language and culture is at the moment? I'm an Anglican, so it'd be wrong of me to kind of way pronounce on this question. What I would say is that as a very sympathetic observer of Catholicism, I prefer the older translation of the Mass. But that's just me. I think that there's an argument to be had here. One is, you know, do you need a special language to maintain the seriousness, the reverence of this, which, you know, probably is going to end up being at some distance from ordinary culture, or do you try and use the language of ordinary culture, running the risk that it might not actually be up to the job? And I'm not sure. What needs to be done is that all of you need to be able to translate the language of faith into the language of everyday life. And in effect, that's something we've all got to take responsibility for, I'm afraid. Thank you.
You've gained a reputation as being, what should we say, a thorn in Dawkins' side. You've also written a book recently, well I say recently, I think it was a few years ago, The Twilight of Atheism. Do you think he's done a tremendous amount of damage? And do you think there is a twilight of atheism, or it seems to me to be alive and kicking?
Two questions really. One has Richard Dawkins injected new life into atheism? Number two, is there really a twilight of atheism? On the second point, I mean, my own view is that atheism has run out of steam and depends on religious people being very, very foolish to actually have an ongoing life. And the rise of religious fundamentalism, especially in the Middle East, I think does make a lot of people very, very worried. So I think there's always something there beyond our control which keeps this alive. But actually there's a sense in which atheism depends upon a vibrant faith to keep it going in culture. But on Dawkins, it's very, very interesting. There was a very interesting article in the Times last year asking who would be the new Richard Dawkins. Because he's not a young man anymore, if I can just put it like that. And the answer it gave was, well, nobody wants to be the new Richard Dawkins because, in effect, it's a tainted, he's in effect overstated, he's become very dogmatic, and actually, he is not a good poster boy for atheism at all. And that means that an awful lot of Christian apologists, and I might include myself among the number, do tend to say, as the world's leading atheist Richard Dawkins says, because you're aware that actually he does have a very, very high profile, but actually it's a damaged profile. That actually there are many atheists who would say, I'm an atheist, but not like him. They see that very much as being a negative portrayal of atheism. So it is interesting, and one of the things I've noticed is that this movement that we loosely call the New Atheism, which really began in 2006 with Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion, actually it's fading away. I think it's partly because when it arrived, it seemed entirely new and exciting and vibrant. It's going to change the world. I mean, it's being talked about still, but it is fading away. And interestingly, with your new Pope Francis, I mean, he is generating an awful lot of very positive news copy at the moment. And I think people are just saying, well, there's Richard Dawkins and there's Francis, and we know who seems to be the nicer guy. And actually, I know that's not how I should judge things, but it's the way an awful lot of people do judge things. Thank you. Let's keep going, please.
Just to get my mind straight. It's a question about role modelling. I don't know if you've got any thoughts on it at all, but I think the image of a saviour, such as the very majestic Aslan, to save us from our life of sin, can be quite disempowering. And I'm interested in how Lewis used the four children as engineers of their own journey, and I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yes, the question is Lewis's image of Aslan ultimately disempowering for children, or indeed for all of us? I think it's a very fair question. It's interesting because one of the issues that Lewis is really trying to explore is what empowers us to do things that we think lie beyond our abilities. And actually, if you look at the children, each of them in their own ways ends up transcending their limits. And again, if you read Rowan Williams on this, the point he makes, I think, very, very well, is that there is something about Aslan which inspires or motivates or enables the children to want to do something special and actually to do it. And what's interesting is if you look at each of the four Pevensey children, The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, they're all empowered in different ways. And so it's not as if there's some stereotype, which they all conform to. It's almost as if Aslan enables them all in their own individual ways to move on, to become better people. And I think that's very interesting. Lewis clearly is writing with his own experience in mind, but there are clearly other experiences being brought into play as well. So I think what I'd say is that the whole theme of how we empower people, how we enable people to say, actually, I have messed up, I'm not as good as I should be, but I would like to try and become a better person. That's very, very important, because our culture at the moment doesn't really want to say that. It says you're all great, it's wonderful, whereas most of us say, well, actually, we don't think we are. We think we need to be told how things are so we can actually do something about it. And Lewis is bringing out very, very clearly how Aslan enables children to see themselves as they really are, but at the same time gives them a vision of what they could become and enables them to begin to achieve that. So I think Lewis actually is doing some very interesting stuff in those novels, which is well worth thinking about for spirituality, if not for anything else. Thank you. time is not on our side. I think we might have time for two more, then we must end. Who'd like to be next, please? Two more questions. Right at the back.
G.K. Chesterton,
Yes.
how much, given the fact you don't like 1936, how much of Chesterton aided Lewis on his conversion, and how much of Chesterton aided him after his conversion?
How much of Chesterton aided Lewis in his conversion and then subsequently aided Lewis after his conversion? In Surprised by Joy, Lewis makes it very, very clear that G.K. Chesterton's Eternal Man was transformative. It was a landmark in his reading, and as an atheist, he said, this book showed me that there was a Christian vision of history which actually made sense. So, there's no doubt that Chesterton was a major influence on Lewis. Obviously, he never met the man, but there was a clear realization that Chesterton was a man who articulated an intellectual vision of Christianity which excited Lewis. I think that's very important. Subsequently, Lewis does pick up on some Chestertonian themes. For example, I can see echoes of Chesterton in Lewis's discussion of the Incarnation, but he doesn't actually make that all that explicit. But there's no doubt that Lewis saw himself as a successor to Chesterton, in effect building on what Chesterton had done and trying to update Chesterton to the situation in and after the Second World War. Now, the sad thing about that is that for many people, Lewis probably did it better than Chesterton did. And so actually the sense in which Chesterton stands in Lewis's shadow now, I think that is a shame, because Chesterton to me remains a writer who is profoundly worth reading. And I think that, that if Lewis makes more people read Chesterton, that's going to be a good thing. Thank you. Our last question this morning, please. Let's take this gentleman here.
It's a comment rather than a question. Many years ago, it must be 50 years ago, I first read the Screwtape Letters. And since that time, I've read the Screwtape Letters and Screwtape proposes a toast every Lent. And it is quite extraordinary how every time you read those, it hits you and questions your own approach to living. It is a very, very remarkable book indeed. As I say, it's a comment.
Well, it's a comment, but it's a good comment. One I would have to endorse, because one of the things I've noticed is when I read Lewis the first time, I see certain things and obviously miss an awful lot. Time two, I pick up more and more and more as you go on. And what I think is so interesting about the Screwtape Letters is that actually, in one sense, the spiritual advice he gives you is quite traditional. But it's the way in which he presents it, the framework, that actually holds your attention, which is so interesting. Yes. That was a very nice comment, but I'll give you one more question, and there was one here. Yes.
What drew Lewis to convert to Catholicism in the end of his life?
What drew Lewis to convert to Catholicism at the end of his life? Well, you and I might have to have an argument about this, because I'm not sure he did really. I've read some articles that suggest he did. I'm not myself sure. I think that what we can say is that some of his later writings, and I think especially the book which is published as Letters to Malcolm on Prayer, that shows clear sympathy with a lot of Catholic ideas. But the question really is, how far did Lewis go down that road? If Lewis had lived another 5 years, what would have happened? We don't know, I'm afraid. That's the long and the short of it. But certainly, as I was saying in response to earlier questions, Lewis was very receptive to a lot of Catholic ideas, and I think also held a number of Catholic writers in very high regard. And Chesterton, I think, probably is the one that stands out for most of us. But there are others who Lewis clearly liked, although we've largely forgotten some of them today, I'm afraid. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's been a pleasure speaking to you, and let me thank you for some wonderful questions.